Hello BookTube. Today I'm talking about a book in the Flashman series. This is Flashman and the Mountain of Light by MacDonald Fraser. It was originally published in 1990 and is the 9th book in the Flashman series. That's a 9th book out of 12 total. Although in my case, because after a certain point I started reading these books out of order, due to living in Cambodia and not having a major English bookstore near me and just finding these books as I could in used bookstores, I actually read this book as the last book in the Flashman series, meaning I had read all the other books in the Flashman series by the time I got my hands on this one. And what a book to end on. This is just classic Flashman. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Flashman, I've talked about him a lot before in previous videos, and I've even done an introduction to the Flashman series, and I'll link to everything in the description down below. But just briefly, the Flashman books are historical fiction. They're humorous historical fiction because Flashman plays a bit of a scoundrel character who, through conniving and just sheer luck, usually ends up portraying himself as a hero, even though he has no heroic qualities whatsoever. The books vary, they go all over the globe, but they're most typical when they take place in some part of the British Empire. And the books are fascinating because they will take you inside some episode in the British Empire, which is all but forgotten nowadays, but which, was a big, bloody military deal at the time. And they're very well researched, lots of footnotes in the back, kind of backing up much of what's in the text. The character of Flashman himself is fictional, but he interacts with all sorts of other historical figures. So, Flashman and the Mountain of Light is about the Sikh War, which occurred in British India in 1845 and 1846. I never heard of it before I picked up this book. I suspect many of you have never heard of it, but there are all sorts of fascinating details in here. Now, the title of the book, The Mountain of Light, is the English translation of Koh-i-Noor, which is a famous diamond from India, which during the Sikh War ended up coming into British hands, and Flashman narrates some of the events that led up to that, and is still in Britain today. It became the possession of Queen Victoria and got passed down from the monarchs. According to Wikipedia, I think they said it was still a part of the crown jewels of Queen Elizabeth II, who's now passed away, hasn't she? So I don't know, maybe King Charles has it now. But interesting little tidbit about that. Last week, I reviewed The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I'll link to that in the description down below as well, which is about a diamond from India that comes into England. And I forgot to mention this when I was doing my video review of this book, but Wilkie Collins was inspired by the Koh-i-Noor diamond. In fact, he writes it directly in his preface, that the events of the Koh-i-Noor diamond coming to England were what inspired this story. So that's a little tie-in between Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, which I talked about last week, and Flashman and the Mountain of Light, which I'm talking about today. So, there are all sorts of interesting figures in here. There's Alexander Gardner and Josiah Harlan, who are two adventurers who go out and have crazy adventures in British India. Josiah Harlan is actually an American, and this is one of those little details you pick up by reading the book and by reading the footnotes that George MacDonald Fraser has put in there. But Josiah Harlan was the inspiration for Rudyard Kipling's story, The Man Who Would Be King. Another interesting thing I picked up from this story is there were actually some really big battles in the Sikh War. I mean, when you picture kind of British India, you picture like some minor skirmishes and no real big set battle pieces. Or maybe you picture the British Army just overpowering the native Indians and there being real no big battles. But that's one of the big themes of this book, actually, is that despite popular misconceptions, there were some really big battles in there. The character Flashman makes a point of pontificating about this at the beginning of the book, saying that a lot of people think that the British Army won the empire through just sheer, overwhelming, one-sided military might. But actually, there's some really big battles there. And then near the end of the book, we have a really big battle. It seems like more something you'd associate with the Napoleonic Wars than with the British India. And in fact, one of the battles that's described in this book is even described as the Indian Waterloo in terms of all the forces accumulated for this. Now, somebody other than me is going to have to talk about the historical accuracy of this book. As always, George MacDonald Fraser has backed up everything in this book, just about everything, with extensive footnotes in the back. So as you're reading the book, you're like, okay, that can't possibly be true. That's way too weird. But then you go to the footnotes in the back, and sure enough, George MacDonald Fraser has sources for all of this. Now, I suspect, as I suspect with a lot of these Flashman books, that he's relying on sensationalist sources. Contemporary sources, Victorian sources, who would exaggerate the sensationalist stuff going on in the courts of Lahore for a European audience, because there are all sorts of sex and scandals and murder and intrigues in the Indian courts that I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's historical, maybe it's exaggerated. Like I said, somebody else will have to comment on that. I have my suspicions, but I don't know anything. Before I picked up this book, I didn't even know that the Sikh Wars even existed. So there you go. There also is maybe a little bit of Orientalism going on here, but again, somebody else will have to comment on it. I don't really know anything. The final thing is this book, as is I think typical of the later Flashman books, has a little bit of a polemical edge to it, where both Flashman himself as our narrator and George MacDonald Fraser, the author, in one of his appendices, is making the case that the British Army was completely in the right here and had this war forced upon them by the aggressive Sikhs. Fraser seems to be writing in reaction to people who are critical of the British Empire, saying that although certain people have said that this war was the fault of the British Empire, really the British Empire had this war forced upon them by an overly aggressive neighbor, and there was nothing that they could do about it. Once again, I'm going to have to say I'm a little bit uneasy with that interpretation, just because of my own politics tend to be a natural anti-imperialist bias. But I'm going to have to leave that to somebody else. I don't know anything about it. For all I know, George MacDonald Fraser could be right. I've said this before in my reviews of Flashman, how sometimes there's some of the politics in the book make me feel a little bit uneasy. Maybe that's putting it a little bit strongly. it doesn't keep me up at night, but it makes me think that, okay, perhaps this is a point of view that I might not agree with if I were better informed. But the books are just so much fun that you just have to set all that aside. And even if some of the stuff in here is exaggerated, there's just so much interesting historical detail in here. So if you haven't picked up the Flashman books yet, by all means check them out. I think this is one of the best ones, but start at the beginning and work through the series. And if you've already picked up book number 1, then you don't need my convincing to get you to keep reading this. These books are a lot of fun. And by all means, if you know anything about this period of history and you can enlighten me in my ignorance as to how accurate or inaccurate this portrayal is, let me know in the comments. Thank you, BookTube.